The sound of bone breaking is something you never forget. It echoes inside your skull louder than any scream. One second I was clutching my father's will, the next. My brother Mark lunged across the polished oak table of the attorney's office, his face twisted with a rage that looked almost inhuman. Before I had time to shield myself, his hand gripped my wrist with crushing force and twisted violently. The snap was sickening. A jagged lightning bolt of pain shot up my arm, and the world went white. I collapsed to the floor, my breath torn from me, my body convulsing against the burn of agony. My scream ripped through the silent conference room, but no one moved. My glasses slid off my face and clattered uselessly against the hardwood. The polished leather shoes of our father's longtime lawyer, Mr. Bennett, shuffled backward in shock. A cousin gasped, but said nothing. My stepmother Linda sat rigid in her chair, lips pressed into a thin, triumphant smile, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. I writhed on the floor, clutching my broken arm to my chest. But Mark towered over me, shouting, "You will not steal from me, Claire! Dad's estate is mine. You think you can manipulate him into leaving you the apartment, the savings, the house, over my dead body?" His voice thundered against the paneled walls, spittle flying from his mouth. The attorney tried to intervene, stammering about calling security, but Mark shoved him aside, his broad frame blotting out the fluorescent light above me. I tasted iron in my mouth and realized I had bitten my tongue during the fall. Blood pooled warm and metallic across my teeth, the taste of betrayal mixed with copper. Around me, relatives who had gathered for what was supposed to be a solemn reading of our father's final wishes now whispered among themselves. None came to help. One uncle muttered, "She must have provoked him." Another cousin shook her head as though confirming something she had always suspected. They looked at me not with horror at my suffering, but with suspicion, as though I had orchestrated this violence for attention. My stepmother's voice cut through the fog of pain, syrupy and cruel. "Claire, stop being dramatic. You always did try to make everything about yourself. Your brother just lost his father. Have some compassion." I wanted to scream at her, to spit the truth in her face, that I had been the one sitting at Dad's bedside every night, adjusting his oxygen spoon, feeding him soup, keeping track of his medications while Mark gambled, and Linda whispered in his ear about selling property. But no words would come. My throat felt raw, the sobs trapped like stones. Mark crouched close, his breath hot against my cheek, eyes burning with a hatred so personal, it cut deeper than any fracture. "You're not getting a cent," he hissed, gripping my collar and shaking me as if I were a child again. "If you fight me, I'll destroy you. No one believes you. No one will take your side. You're weak, Claire. Always have been." The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, a cruel reminder of the ordinary world continuing outside this nightmare. My body trembled not just from the searing pain, but from the terrifying realization that this was not just about money, it was about control. He wanted me erased, humiliated, broken into silence. And the worst part was at that moment, as my arm throbbed and my vision blurred, I almost believed he had already won. The hospital lights were harsh and cold, a sterile white that made everything feel unreal, as if I had been dropped into someone else's nightmare. My arm was immobilized in a cast, painkillers dulling the edge, but not the memory. Every throb reminded me of my brother's hands crushing my bones, of his voice dripping with hatred. I thought the waiting room might offer me peace, but instead, it became another stage for my humiliation. Two cousins arrived, whispering in low tones that carried clearly in the quiet space. "She must have pushed him to the limit," one said, avoiding my eyes. The other sighed. "Mark has always been hot-headed, but Claire knows how to provoke. She should have just let him have the house." Their words cut deeper than the fracture. Even here, even with my body broken, the narrative had shifted against me. The attorney, Mr. Bennett, had been the only one to insist on filing a police report. Yet even he looked hesitant, as though he feared the social weight of siding with me. When the officer arrived, he scribbled notes with a practiced boredom and then said, "Family disputes get messy. Maybe it's best if you both cool off." Cool off? My arm was shattered, and they called it cooling off. Linda, my stepmother, swept into the room with perfect hair and a designer bag, her face painted with false concern. She touched my shoulder lightly like a snake brushing prey. Claire, you always take things too far. Mark is grieving. You should have kept quiet instead of demanding attention with lawyers and paperwork. Your father never wanted drama. Why dishonor his memory like this? The audacity left me trembling. I had been the one who slept on a cot beside Dad's bed, who spoon-fed him oatmeal when he was too weak to lift a spoon, who wiped his forehead during fevers, while Linda vanished for spa weekends, and Mark disappeared into casinos. And now, in front of the officer and my relatives, she painted me as selfish, manipulative, the troublemaker who provoked her poor son. My throat clenched shut. Gaslighting had always been Linda's specialty, turning black into white bruises, into imagined scratches, my pain into my fault. Mark himself appeared at the door, his presence looming even while security guards tried to block him. He shouted, "Tell them the truth! Claire, tell them you twisted Dad's mind before he died. You forged his will." His words rang out down the corridor, and though the guards pushed him away, the damage was done. Every pair of eyes in that waiting area now looked at me, as if wondering whether his accusations carried weight. I lowered my gaze, cheeks burning with a humiliation hotter than any fire. No one defended me. No one stood to say, "That's a lie." My cast itched against my skin, a physical reminder that I was trapped, voiceless, cornered. The whisper swelled again, a tide of judgment. I could not escape. In that moment, I understood what my father must have felt in his last days, surrounded by those who claimed to love him, yet abandoned to whisper's control and silence. The hospital smell of disinfectant stung my nostrils sharp and unforgiving. For the first time since childhood, I wondered whether blood ties meant anything at all, or whether family could become the cruelest prison of all. When I was a little girl, I thought family meant safety, that the walls of our modest suburban home in Denver were supposed to shelter me from cruelty. But growing up in the Donovan household taught me that blood does not always protect. Sometimes it stains. My father, Richard Donovan, was a strict man, but a fair one, a factory supervisor who believed in hard work and honesty. He never had much softness in his voice, but when he looked at me, there was warmth, a belief that I was worth something. My brother Mark, 3 years older, had always been the golden child. From the moment he could walk, everyone said he would carry on the Donovan name, strong, confident, destined for greatness. But behind closed doors, that greatness revealed itself as violence. He learned early that if he shoved me against the wall or twisted my arm until I cried, our father would scold him lightly, "Boys will be boys," while telling me to toughen up. Each bruise faded, each scar hid beneath sleeves, but the message was carved into me. Mark's temper was a storm I had to survive. When our mother died young, my father remarried quickly. Linda entered our lives with sharp perfume and sharper eyes, a woman who smiled sweetly in public, but dissected me in private. "You're too sensitive, Claire," she would say whenever Mark mocked my clothes or pulled my hair. "If you didn't react, he wouldn't bother you." She called me weak, dramatic, selfish, planting doubts in my young mind until I started believing them. It was gaslighting before I even knew the word. By the time I turned 15, I had learned silence as a survival tactic, bottling my thoughts, while Mark basked in endless praise. He got the new car at 16, I got a lecture about responsibility. He flunked a semester in college, Dad paid off his debts, while I worked 2 part-time jobs just to cover community college fees. Linda clucked her tongue at me as if my struggle was proof of my incompetence. "You'll never get far in life, Claire. Be grateful your brother looks out for you." Looked out for me, the same brother who once slammed my head into the refrigerator door because I ate the last slice of pizza. No one saw that bruise either. My father aged quickly after 50, his body bent by years of factory shifts, his lungs weakened by decades of smoke. When the cancer diagnosis came, it was like a clock began ticking, each day louder, each night heavier. Linda pretended to be the devoted wife in public, attending church luncheons and speaking about caregiving. But at home, she vanished on spa trips or shopping sprees, leaving me with the task of feeding Dad soup, cleaning his sheets, keeping track of morphine doses. Mark rarely appeared except to ask Dad about property deeds or whisper about investments. Even then, I could see the irritation in my father's eyes, the disappointment he never dared voice too loudly. It was in those late nights at the bedside that Dad confessed his fears to me. "Claire, he whispered one night, his voice cracked with pain. "I don't trust them with the house. Mark, he has no discipline. And Linda, she only sees dollar signs." His hand, frail and veined, clutched mine. "Promise me you won't let them take everything. Promise me you'll stand strong." I promised. I didn't know then how heavy those words would become. The last months were a blur of medication charts, hushed prayers, and the smell of antiseptic. I kept a journal writing down every conversation, every decision about Dad's care, not because I thought it would matter, but because it was the only way to stay sane. I recorded the nights Linda screamed at me that I was doing the injections wrong, the mornings Mark demanded access to Dad's bank account to pay bills. I wrote it all down, the silent evidence of a war waged behind suburban curtains. When Dad finally passed, his breath rattling one last time as I held his hand, it was as if my heart was ripped from my chest. I thought the grief would unite us, that Mark might finally see me as his sister instead of his enemy. But within hours, Linda was on the phone arranging meetings with attorneys. At the funeral, Mark wore a perfectly tailored suit, delivered a eulogy about responsibility and family values, and shook hands with guests like a politician. I stood alone by the casket, my body hollow, my spirit already sensing the storm to come. It was not long after that the threats began. Mark cornered me in the kitchen 2 days after the burial, slamming his fist against the counter. Dad was going to leave everything to me. "Don't try to twist this. If you even think of contesting the will, I'll make sure no one believes you." His words sent me spiraling back to childhood, the familiar terror of his towering frame. But I had grown, I had learned. I kept my face blank, my journal hid in my phone recording. Linda added her venom during dinners, smiling sweetly in front of neighbors, while whispering poison in my ear. "You'll regret making waves, Claire. Everyone knows you're unstable. We'll put you in a place where you can rest away from the stress." A place. I knew what she meant. A facility. A way to strip me of credibility, to paint me as the hysterical daughter, the unstable one who could not be trusted with inheritance. Their plan was becoming clear long before the diorama of violence in the attorney's office. Yet I still believed foolishly that decency might hold them back. I thought maybe grief would soften them, that the loss of our father might remind Mark that family is more than property. I was wrong. That fracture in my arm at the reading of the will was not an accident, not a loss of control. It was the culmination of decades of entitlement violence and gaslighting. It was my brother announcing to the world what he had always believed, that my body, my voice, my future were his to break. My name is Claire Donovan. I am 32 years old, and on paper, I look like nothing more than an ordinary woman trying to make ends meet in Denver. I work as an accountant in a mid-sized firm, the kind of job that makes people's eyes glaze over when I describe it at parties, but I like numbers because they do not lie. They do not twist themselves into daggers like people do. Numbers tell the truth clean and sharp, and that has always been my refuge. I drive an old Honda Civic with a dented door. I shop at outlet stores for clothes, and most nights I cook simple meals alone in my apartment. To the outside world, and especially to my brother Mark and stepmother Linda, I appear fragile, unthreatening, someone easy to dismiss. But appearances are deceiving. Beneath the quiet exterior, I have the meticulous habits of someone who has been forced to watch every detail in order to survive. I keep notebooks filled with dates, conversations, times when Mark raised his fist, times when Linda lied to my father's face. I have voice recordings saved in a hidden folder on my laptop, documenting Mark's rages when he thought no one would ever hold him accountable. I have bank statements that show Linda siphoning money from Dad's account documents she thought were buried under piles of paperwork, but that I copied quietly in the dead of night. I never planned to use these records. For years, I collected them like a child collects seashells, each one proof that I was not crazy, that my pain was real even when everyone else denied it. I am not tall. I am not loud. I am not physically strong, but I carry an inner steel forged by years of being silenced. The irony is that Mark always called me weak, but the weak do not survive decades of cruelty with their sanity intact. What he never understood is that my greatest strength was patience, the ability to wait, to observe, to prepare. He thought I was a pawn on his chessboard, a piece he could shove around, but I was studying the board all along. And when the time came, I would know exactly how to move. The weeks after my father's funeral became a suffocating blur of threats, whispers, and escalating violence each day. Another reminder that my family was no longer family, but predators circling the wounded. Mark showed up at my apartment unannounced one night, pounding on the door with such force that the frame rattled. I refused to open, but his voice bellowed through the hallway for every neighbor to hear, calling me a liar, a thief, a manipulator who had poisoned our father's mind. I stood frozen inside, clutching my phone, recording every word while tears slid down my face. When the knocking stopped, I thought it was over, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. He had taken a rock from the street and smashed my car window, leaving shards glittering across the seats like a warning. The next morning, Linda's voice slithered through the phone. "Claire, why do you insist on dragging this out? You know you can't handle responsibility. You've always been fragile. It would be better for everyone if you signed over your share and let Mark manage things. That way you won't embarrass yourself in court." I hung up, but her words dug into me like barbs. Gaslighting was her favorite tool, making me question my own sanity, making me wonder if I was overreacting. Yet the cast on my arm was proof of the truth, a bone-deep reminder of how far Mark was willing to go. A week later, I returned home to find my front door ajar. My stomach turned to ice as I stepped inside. The drawers had been pulled open, papers scattered across the floor. They had searched for something, and I knew exactly what: my journals, my recordings, the quiet archive of their crimes. Heart racing, I rushed to the hiding spot under my bed where I kept a locked box. It was still there, but the lock showed scratches, a sign of a desperate attempt. Rage burned through my fear. They were not just trying to silence me. They wanted to erase the evidence, to rewrite the story before it ever reached the light of day. The escalation did not stop there. Anonymous letters appeared under my door, typed in block letters. "Drop the claim or end up in a hospital. Everyone knows you're unstable. The judge will never side with you." Each note was a knife to my nerves, but I refused to let them see me bleed. Still, the pressure mounted until one night it burst into violence again. I had just returned from the pharmacy when Mark's car screeched to a stop outside my building. He stormed out, eyes wild, reeking of whiskey. "You think you can beat me?" he roared, shoving me hard against the wall. Pain shot through my cast as it hit the brick, my body crumpling under his weight. I gasped for breath as his hand closed around my throat, squeezing his face inches from mine. "If you ruin this for me, I'll finish what I started at the lawyer's office." For a moment, blackness closed in spots, dancing in my vision. Then the sound of a neighbor's door creaking open broke the spell. Mrs. Atkins, a retired nurse from across the hall, shouted, "I'm calling the police!" Mark released me with a shove, spitting curses as he ran back to his car. My lungs burned as I gulped air, my body shaking from the narrow escape. That night, the police finally came, taking my statement while I held an ice pack to the bruises on my neck. Yet even then, the officers seemed reluctant. "Family disputes are complicated," one muttered, echoing the same tired refrain. Complicated. That was the word they used to excuse violence, to dismiss terror. But I was done being dismissed. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the pile of threats, the broken glass, the bruises blossoming purple across my throat. My fear had been forged into something sharper: resolve. If Mark and Linda wanted a war, I would give them one, but it would not be fought with fists or screams. It would be fought with truth, with evidence, with allies who could not be intimidated. I began gathering everything I had: the recordings of Mark's tirades, the bank statements showing Linda's siphoning, the journals detailing years of abuse. I scanned and backed up every file, storing copies online on USB drives, in places they would never reach. Each click of the scanner was a small act of defiance, a declaration that their power was crumbling. They tried to escalate again, sending texts late at night. "No one believes you. Dad always said you were unstable. Give up before you destroy yourself." But I answered with silence, because my answer would not be in words, it would be in court. The escalation had pushed me into a corner, but corners can also sharpen resolve. With every attack, they only armed me further. My arm was healing slowly, but inside, something had already healed stronger than before. The conviction that I was not weak, I was not alone and I was not finished. The morning after Mark's drunken assault, I realized survival alone would not be enough. I needed reinforcements, people who believed me, people who could shield me when the system preferred to look away. My first call was to Mr. Bennett, the attorney who had handled my father's will. He answered with a weary sigh, his voice rough from too many sleepless nights. "Claire, I was afraid this would happen. Your brother is unraveling." I clenched the phone tighter, my bruised neck aching with every swallow. "He won't stop, Mr. Bennett. I need more than sympathy. I need someone to fight with me." There was a long pause, then his tone shifted sharper. "Come to my office this afternoon. We'll discuss legal options. Bring every scrap of evidence you have." Relief fluttered in my chest, fragile but real. I spent the hours before the meeting organizing everything into folders, bank statements, medical reports, the photos of my cast, the police report, even the text messages dripping with threats. When I slid them across his polished desk later that day, Bennett studied them with an intensity that gave me hope. "You're not imagining this," he said firmly. "This is a pattern of coercion and abuse. We can build a case, but he warned me family court is messy. They'll paint you as unstable. You'll need more than paper. You'll need witnesses." My mind immediately turned to Rachel, my neighbor from the apartment downstairs. She had been there the night Mark tried to strangle me, had seen him fleeing down the hallway while I clutched my throat. When I knocked on her door, she welcomed me in with the warmth of someone who had already decided which side she was on. I heard everything she said before I even spoke. "I'll testify. He's a monster." Her certainty steadied me like a hand on my back. One ally. But I knew I needed more. That night, scrolling through the list of private investigators online, one name caught my eye. Thomas Hale, former cop turned independent PI known for digging into cases no one else touched. I dialed his number, half expecting no answer, but a gravelly voice picked up. "Hale Investigations." I hesitated, then spilled everything: my broken arm, the threats, the missing documents, the fear that my brother and stepmother were plotting to declare me incompetent. He listened without interruption, then said, "Meet me tomorrow morning. Bring copies of everything. If what you're saying is true, I'll find the rest." When I met him at his small downtown office walls, lined with filing cabinets and photos of missing people he had once tracked down, I felt a flicker of safety. He scanned my evidence, nodding. "This isn't just family drama. This is financial exploitation layered with physical abuse. If they're desperate enough, they'll escalate. We'll get ahead of it." Over the following weeks, Hale uncovered truths that chilled me. He traced Mark's gambling debts, tens of thousands owed to underground bookies. He found that Linda had secretly taken out a home equity loan on a property Dad still legally owned, forging his signature months before his death. He obtained surveillance footage from a casino showing Mark losing thousands in a single night, while Linda wired money from Dad's account to cover the losses. Piece by piece, the facade of respectability crumbled. When Hale handed me the final report, thick with photographs, receipts, and audio transcripts, I felt both vindicated and nauseated. These weren't just mistakes, they were crimes. But I also knew that exposing them would provoke fury unlike anything I had seen. Mr. Bennett agreed to represent me formally, preparing motions to protect my share of the estate. Rachel gave her statement to police describing Mark's attack in vivid detail. Hale promised to testify if needed, armed with evidence that would shred Linda's carefully cultivated image. For the first time in months, I felt less like prey and more like a fighter assembling an army. Of course, Mark and Linda didn't stay quiet. They ramped up their campaign, filing a petition in court to question my mental stability. The documents dripped with lies, claims that I had hallucinations, that I had been violent toward my father, that I was incapable of managing money. They even convinced a few relatives to sign affidavits parroting their narrative. Reading those papers nearly broke me, but Bennett tapped the stack with one finger. "Let them dig their hole. We have facts, they have smoke. When this goes before a judge, facts win." Still, the anxiety gnawed at me until Hale handed me a small recording device. "Wear this whenever you meet them," he instructed. "People like your brother can't hide their true nature for long." He was right. 2 nights later, Mark cornered me in a parking lot, spewing threats about how he'd have me locked in a psychiatric ward. Every word was captured crystal clear. When I played the tape back for Bennett, he allowed himself a rare smile. "This," he said, "is the sound of your victory." With allies by my side and evidence piled high, I began to believe that justice was possible. The fear still lived in me, coiled tight, but alongside it grew something stronger resolve. For the first time, the story of my life was no longer just about surviving their abuse. It was about turning every wound into testimony, every bruise into proof, every betrayal into a weapon they could not silence. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and nerves, the kind of sterile air that carried whispers and footsteps like secrets. When I walked into the courtroom for the first hearing, my cast still stiff around my wrist, though the bone had begun to mend, I felt every gaze land on me like a weight. Mark sat at the defense table in a tailored navy suit, his hair slicked back, his expression carefully arranged into one of righteous indignation. Linda sat beside him dressed in pearls and a conservative blazer, her face twisted into a mask of maternal sorrow. They looked like victims. They looked like family. And I, with my pale skin and trembling hands, was supposed to look like the hysterical accuser. But I had prepared for this moment. Bennett stood at my side, his briefcase brimming with evidence. Rachel sat behind me, her eyes fierce, ready to speak the truth. Hale leaned against the wall near the back, arms folded, the bulging file in his possession, a silent promise of revelation. When the judge entered, a hush fell over the room. The bailiff called us to order, and I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. Mark's attorney launched first, spinning a narrative that painted me as unstable. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "this is a tragic case of a grieving family torn apart by one member's fragile state of mind. Ms. Donovan has unfortunately allowed paranoia to distort her memories. My client, Mark Donovan, has only ever sought to protect his sister, even when she lashed out." My mouth burned as if I had swallowed fire. Protect me. The man who had broken my arm in front of witnesses was now draped in the cloak of a hero. Linda dabbed her eyes with a tissue, sniffing theatrically. "She doesn't know what she's saying," she murmured just loud enough for the gallery to hear. The judge turned to Bennett. "Your response." Bennett's voice was calm, firm like a man laying bricks to build an unshakable wall. "Your Honor, the defense has woven a story with no fabric." "We have evidence, we have testimony, and we have the truth." He nodded to me, and my chest tightened. This was it. I stood, my knees trembling, but my voice steady enough. "On the day of the will reading, my brother assaulted me. He broke my arm in front of witnesses." Gasps fluttered through the gallery. Mark shook his head violently. "She's lying," he shouted, but the judge silenced him with a glare. Bennett gestured, and Rachel took the stand. Her testimony was clear, precise, her voice unwavering. "I saw Mark attack Claire outside her apartment. I saw him choke her. If I hadn't shouted for police, I don't know what would have happened." The defense tried to discredit her, calling her a meddling neighbor, but she held firm, eyes locked on the jury box. Then came Hale. He approached the stand with the casual authority of a man who had seen the rot beneath too many polished surfaces. He presented receipts, bank transfers, photos of market casinos squandering money, copies of Linda's fraudulent loan applications. Each exhibit landed like a hammer blow. The gallery murmured louder, the air thick with scandal. Linda shifted uncomfortably, her composure cracking. When Hale produced the recording of Mark threatening to have me locked in a psychiatric ward, the room exploded in gasps. The judge raised her gavel for silence, but the damage was done. Mark's voice, snarling and cruel, filled the courtroom speakers. "If you ruin this for me, I'll finish what I started." The sound was undeniable, the venom undeniable. Mark slumped in his chair, color draining from his face. Bennett leaned into the blow. "This is not the voice of a protective brother, Your Honor. This is the voice of a man consumed by greed, willing to destroy his own sister for money." My turn came again, and I stood once more, lifting my arm carefully. The cast was gone, but the scar was raw, the memory carved into my body. "This," I said, raising it for all to see, "is what my brother's protection looks like. A broken arm, a fractured life, years of silence. And for what? Because I refused to hand him the keys to everything our father built." My voice wavered, but I pressed on louder now, fueled by the stares of people who had doubted me for so long. I cared for our father when he was dying. I held his hand when he took his last breath. And yet in this room they call me unstable, unworthy, a liar. But the truth is written in bruises and in bank ledgers. The truth is here. Linda erupted suddenly, her mask ripped away by desperation. She manipulated him, she cried, pointing at me with trembling hands. She twisted Richard against us, poisoned him. She's always been jealous, always hated us. The judge's gavel cracked. Enough, sit down, Mrs. Donovan. But her slip had already betrayed her. Bennett seized the moment. Jealous of what? A mountain of gambling debts, fraudulent loans, an inheritance you sought to steal through lies. His voice thundered across the chamber. The defense attorney stammered, fumbling through papers. But the narrative was collapsing. The gallery, once skeptical, now leaned forward with hungry eyes, recording on phones despite the bailiff's warnings. They knew they were watching a family unravel in real time. The judge called for order, then delivered her verdict on the preliminary matters. The evidence against Mark Donovan is compelling. The charge of assault stands. Furthermore, this court finds reason to investigate allegations of financial misconduct by Linda Donovan. My knees nearly buckled, but Rachel's hand steadied me. The room was spinning with the magnitude of it all. Mark's jaw tightened, his eyes blazing with a hatred that could have burned me alive, but he was trapped, shackled by his own words, his own violence. The judge looked directly at him. Mr. Donovan and my courtroom actions have consequences. You will face trial for what you have done. This is not a playground for greed. This is justice. Gasps and murmurs swelled again, a tide of vindication washing over me. For the first time in years, I was not the one being silenced. Mark tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Linda slumped into her chair, pale eyes darting desperately for escape. And I stood taller, breathing fully for the first time since my father's death. The courtroom had become the battleground, and against all odds, the truth was winning. The weeks that followed the hearing were a storm of fallout, each day peeling away another layer of the lies that Mark and Linda had wrapped themselves in. The newspapers picked up the story quickly, local headlines screaming about a son charged with breaking his sister's arm during a will dispute, about suspicious loans taken out in the name of a dying man. Neighbors who had once averted their eyes in the grocery store now whispered sympathy when I passed, some even apologizing for doubting me. But sympathy could not erase the consequences that were finally crashing down on Mark and Linda. The district attorney announced formal charges of aggravated assault against Mark, along with a fraud investigation tied to Linda's forged loan documents. Court summons piled up on their doorstep, reporters camped outside their house, and the same relatives who had once called me dramatic now refused to take their calls. The isolation they had forced on me for years now belonged to them. For once, the silence did not belong to me. It belonged to the predators. Mark's gambling debts surfaced in ugly detail, bookies knocking on his door demanding money he no longer had. Linda tried to maintain her mask of dignity, but when the bank seized the property she had leveraged illegally, the facade collapsed. She was left clutching nothing but excuses. Her voice no longer believed. I remember the day Mark was led into court in handcuffs, the metallic click echoing louder than his protests. He looked smaller, then not the towering bully of my childhood, but a man stripped bare by his own greed. He glared at me across the courtroom, hatred etched into every line of his face. But his threats had lost their weight. The judge ordered him into custody pending trial, denying bail because of the risk of further violence. The sound of the gavel striking wood was the sound of justice finally breathing. Linda's collapse came quieter, but no less devastating. The fraud investigation revealed years of siphoning her fingerprints all over the theft. When confronted with Hale's evidence, her lawyer could do nothing but advise her to negotiate. The image she had spent years polishing at church and social clubs shattered, overnight whispers turning into condemnation. She had always thrived on reputation, and now she lived under the crushing weight of disgrace. The twist, the part they never expected, was that my father had prepared a backup. Months before his death, he had amended his will with Bennett's help, placing protections around his assets, designating trusts that only activated if fraud was suspected. When Bennett revealed this in court, the room gasped. My father had seen through them, had left me a hidden shield I never realized existed. Mark and Linda, who had accused me of manipulation, were undone not by me, but by the foresight of the man they thought they could control. In one moment, their entire plan crumbled to dust. The estate they clawed and bled for slipped out of reach, locked beyond their grasp by legal chains, forged by my father's last act of love. I sat in the courtroom, tears stinging my eyes, realizing that even in death, he had stood by me. The justice was not only in the charges, not only in the public shame, but in the undeniable proof that they had never truly won, that every act of cruelty had only led them here, exposed and defeated. For years, I had been the quiet one, the weak one, the sister who supposedly needed saving. Now I was the survivor, the witness, the one who carried the truth. The consequences were theirs to bear, and I no longer carried their weight. In the aftermath of the verdict and the swirl of media attention that followed, my life felt like scorched earth, a battlefield where the smoke was just beginning to clear. The bruises on my arm faded, the cast came off, but the memories of bones snapping and breath stolen did not vanish as easily. Yet for the first time in years, I could walk into my apartment and feel something like safety. The locks had been changed, cameras installed, and with Hale's advice, I even bought a small safe to protect the journals and recordings that had become my arsenal. Each precaution was not paranoia anymore. It was empowerment proof that I would never again be caught unprepared. Therapy became my next battlefield. I sat across from Dr. Sandoval, a woman with kind eyes and a sharp pen, and poured out decades of silence. She listened as I described growing up in a house where gaslighting was love and bruises were discipline. And she told me what no one had ever dared say: Claire, none of this was your fault. The words cracked something inside me. I wept in that sterile office until my chest ached, but when the tears dried, I felt lighter, as though shedding a skin I had been forced to wear since childhood. Healing did not mean forgetting, it meant reclaiming. I began volunteering at a local shelter that supported victims of domestic abuse, offering financial literacy workshops on weekends. Numbers had always been my language, and teaching women how to manage budget spot exploitation and protect their assets gave me purpose. Many of them saw me as stronger than I felt, but each time I guided them through opening a savings account or reading a lease, I remembered how powerless I once was and how powerful I had become. Bennett remained by my side not only as an attorney, but as a quiet mentor. One afternoon over coffee, he admitted: Claire, I've seen families destroy each other in court, but few fight with the resilience you did. You turned evidence into armor. His respect steadied me in a way I never expected. Rachel became more than a neighbor. She became family by choice. We spent evenings drinking tea on her balcony, laughing about trivial things, rebuilding joy brick by brick. She reminded me that not all bonds were poisoned, that some people showed up not because they had to, but because they chose to. Hale, ever the gruff PI, checked in occasionally with updates about the broader fraud cases spinning out from Linda's schemes. They'll be tied up in court for years, he told me with a smirk. But you get to live free. That freedom tasted strange at first, like a language I was relearning, but soon I savored it. There were lonely nights when the silence felt too heavy, when I wished my father could see me stand tall in the wreckage. But then I remembered that the protections he had built into his will were his last words of love. He had believed in me enough to entrust me with the truth, and that belief carried me through the darkest hours. Slowly, my apartment filled with symbols of new beginnings, plants thriving in sunlight, framed certificates from the workshops I taught, even a stray cat I adopted who curled at my feet as if guarding me from ghosts. I stopped checking the locks 3 times before bed. I stopped jumping every time the phone rang. Healing came in small increments, not dramatic victories, but each one mattered. And with each step I took away from the shadow of Mark and Linda, I felt closer to the version of myself I had always been meant to be: independent, unbroken, whole. The scars on my arm will never vanish, but now I see them not as shame, but as proof. Proof that I endured, proof that I fought back, proof that when a family tried to silence me, I refused to disappear. My healing is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new one written on my own terms. 2 years have passed since that day in court, and when I look at my life now, it feels like I am living in a house rebuilt on stronger foundations walls, reinforced not by illusions of family loyalty, but by truth boundaries and chosen connections. Mark is serving a 5-year sentence for aggravated assault and contempt after lashing out at the judge during his trial, his name reduced from golden child to headline cautionary tale. Linda pled guilty to multiple counts of fraud and now lives in a small rented duplex, far from the church ladies who once admired her pearls. She spends her days paying restitution, her reputation in ashes. Sometimes I wonder if they ever think of me. But the thought no longer hurts, it only reminds me that consequences are real, that every act of cruelty carries a price. My father's foresight ensured my financial stability, and with part of the inheritance, I established a program at the shelter where I now volunteer full-time teaching survivors how to protect their money document abuse and reclaim dignity. We call it the Ledger Project. And every time a woman tells me she opened her first independent account or stood up to a manipulative partner, I feel my father's hand steadying mine from beyond the grave. The program has reached more than 100 women in 2 years, each one proof that suffering can be transformed into something bigger, something that breaks the cycle. At night, I sit on my balcony with Rachel, the air filled with the smell of her jasmine plants, and we talk about everything from court cases to recipes. She has become my sister in truth, not by blood, but by loyalty. Hale still calls occasionally, his gravelly voice reporting updates on other cases of elder abuse he now pursues with renewed vigor. Your story lit a fire, Claire, he told me recently. People are watching, they're speaking up, and that perhaps is the real victory. Not just that I survived, not just that Mark and Linda faced justice, but that others now see their own reflections in my fight and realize silence is not the only option. Healing is not a straight road. There are mornings I still wake with the echo of Mark's voice in my ear, the phantom pressure of his hand on my throat, but I breathe through it, reminding myself those days are gone, locked behind prison walls. There are afternoons when I ache for the father I lost, wishing he could see the garden I've planted in his memory, each bloom a testament to resilience. And there are nights when I trace the scar on my arm and whisper to myself, you lived, you won. If there is one message I carry forward, it is this family is not defined by shared blood, but by shared respect. Gaslighting, control, and violence are not love. They are chains meant to break us. And breaking free is not betrayal, it is survival. To anyone who hears my story, I say this: you are not too weak, you are not too old, you are not too alone to fight back. Justice is not quick, healing is not simple, but both are possible. I am living proof. And as the sun sets over Denver, painting the sky in colors my father would have loved, I sit with Rachel and the cat curled at my feet, and I know this is the family I chose, the peace I built, and the dignity I reclaimed.